welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for Project Highball, the webinar. This is Mark Paisey will be presenting this particular portion of the session, which is focused on the kind of the background and the history to the highballs and some of the introduction to the project itself. Mark, then, if you're ready, I'll mute myself and hand over to you.
Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to this two-part presentation on Project Highball that ran in 2017. I think right from the outset, I have to say that Kevin Phillips and myself, managed this together in a fairly short period of time to produce the presentation, which is mostly Kevin's work, and obviously the project itself when that ran in 2017. Tonight I'm going to cover pretty much the history and how the idea came about and the initial planning ahead of the event. And Kevin on Friday night is going to cover the execution. So this is a more sort of serious topic tonight, and Friday is actually a bit more of the fun stuff. So I hope we get through the technology, but let's have a look. 77 years on from when Highball was developed, it's quite hard to understand how secret this program was. So we're going to refer to upkeep, which was the weapon used against the Ruhr dams in 1943, which is well known as the Dam Busters. But the Highball was delivered and developed alongside, and such was the urgency and need for secrecy that this raid was envisaged having to be carried out within 24 hours of the dams raid. And the two squadrons responsible for this were completely independent of each other and had no knowledge of what the others were doing. But because the technology was similar, the powers that be were very concerned about countermeasures being put in place, more of which later. But 77 years on, the secrecy around this project is quite hard to fathom. And it was only in 1974, after the UK 30-year rule, that the information was put into the public domain. So as we say, it's a two-part presentation. Tonight, part one covers the history and how the project got started. And then part two is the expedition itself. And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little bit of a photo chip. So this is the bit you see in the Dam Busters film. And there's two things to note, which is interesting. So the footage is actually from the test drops in Loch Striven. But also it's a black blob, so it doesn't show what the store or weapon was actually doing. And that's because the film was made in 1955 and still within the official secrets part of it. So let's crack on and have a quick look at the history. So as we said, we're going to talk a little bit to start with about the Dam Busters raid, because this kind of sets the scene. This raid was conducted on the night of May the 16th in 1943 by 617 Squadron. And 617 Squadron was led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, who at the time was 24 years old. And they were targeting three dams in Germany, the Mona, the Eder and the Sorpe dams, which basically produced and held water for the electricity generation in the Ruhr Valley, which is the major industrial area. And this target was identified in the 30s. And funnily enough, we just didn't have the technology to tackle it. If you've ever been to Germany and seen the dams, you'll realise that they're surrounded by tree-covered hills. They were clearly heavily defended. And the operation was called Operation Chastise, and involved 19 Lancaster bombers, 133 aircrew, 53 were killed on that night. And it involved dropping bombs from around about 60 feet over the water at around 230 miles an hour.
It is the night of May the 16th, 1943. In all the skies of Europe at war, one squadron only is flying.
Enemy coast ahead.
Their task, to breach the great dams of the Ruhr Valley. Tonight, they are 617 Squadron. Tomorrow, the world will know them as... You are with the dam busters in action, pouring at tree-top height into the heart of the Third Reich. The human drama which preceded this incredible raid reveals the inspiration and obsession of one man with an idea. Barnes Wallis is the man who refused to admit defeat, who saw his faith rewarded in triumph.
So if you remember in the film, just to remind you, this image here, so this is taken in Loch Striven from the actual tests itself on Highball. But the story starts with this man, Barnes Wallis. So Barnes Wallis was a scientist, an engineer and an innovator. And he started work in the 10s and 20s, basically when the UK had an airship programme, the R100 and the R101, and he was responsible for developing the geodetic airframe, which was essentially very light but strong and gave structure to the gas envelope. The Hindenburg disaster in the early 20s put paid to this technology and use in airships, but the actual geodetic airframe went on to the bombers of the time, possibly including the Wellington bomber and the Wellesley bomber. And this man, he worked for Vickers doused in Brooklands, and in the 30s he actually envisaged the need for strategic bombing of key targets, and he went on to develop some pretty big bombs, but at the time there wasn't an aircraft that was capable of carrying them. But the conclusion of work, which we'll see a bit later, was the Tall Boy at 6 tons and the Grand Slam at 10 tons. And these were the forerunner of today's bunker buster weapons. Even in 1943-44, they entered the Earth at supersonic speeds and penetrated to about 20 meters. And they were used against the submarine pens V2, which is the flying bomb, V3, which was the long-range gun, sights in Northern Europe, and indeed the Tirpitz, which was the target of the Highball. Now, for anyone who's watched the film, you'll know how he got the idea for bouncing bombs, and it came from skipping marbles in his back garden. But the principal problem was we didn't have the accuracy to deliver weapons, and we didn't have the aircraft capable of carrying sufficiently big enough aircraft to carry the weapons at that time. And most defences were in the style of torpedo nets laid in front of targets, so in front of the dams and in front of key capital ships, and they had to get over them. So the idea of skipping and then submerging a weapon close to the target and using the water pressure to concentrate the force of the explosion was his big idea. And if we start looking at the dams raid, we're going to see some interesting comparisons. And we're mentioning this because, remember, these were developed in parallel and the technology was the same. So the aircraft in the top picture is the Lancaster bomber. Most people recognize that. And the bottom left is the upkeep. And the upkeep is the Lancaster version of this store or weapon. And originally, Barnes Wallis knew that the best structure to bounce over the water was a beer keg shape, so essentially slightly squashed and rounded. And if you look back to the old film and the trial footage, you will see that after the round was dropped onto the sea, the casing exploded and the thing wouldn't bounce with the casing on. But because of the width of the upkeep, actually they managed to continue with its develop and found it would bounce just without the casing. So upkeep went on as just the pure store. So that ended up full of explosive and was carried by the Lancaster itself. And if you look at the picture on the right hand side, you'll see it's dropped from low level, so about 60 foot. The speed and range is critical, and it obviously bounced over the water, over the torpedo nets, and it involved backspin. And the backspin is what held the weapon against the wall to ensure it submerged to sufficient depth, and then a hydrostatic fuse basically detonated it and used the water pressure to help focus the charge. So that was the technology that was actually used against the dams. And as you can see, because of the low level of delivery and the heavily defended nature of the targets, why the loss of life amongst basically 20 to 24-year-olds on the night of the 16th of May was so high. So this is a picture of a upkeep. So this was actually carried on the night of May the 16th, and the Lancaster carrying it hit pylons on the Dutch-German border and crashed, and the detonation devices in the weapon weren't fired, so the round actually was captured by the Germans. The Germans went on to develop a version of the bouncing bomb, but they didn't understand the importance of backspin, and they could never get it to work, and the project was cancelled in 1944. So if we compare the two, on the left you'll see upkeep, which we've talked about, and on the right you'll see highball. And what you have to imagine, hopefully you can make out my cursor in a minute, this bit here is the casing, and about here there is a line where these two clamshells are joined together, and this provides the cushioning. This bit here is exactly the same as upkeep, but just shorter. And because it was shorter, it didn't have the stability to bounce without the cladding. And a lot of the trials on the actual casing here was all about what to fill the casing with to withstand the shock of hitting the water at 240 miles an hour without actually damaging the casing. And in the end, they ended up filling this casing with piano glue. But I had the fortunate experience of speaking to a Navy diver who was about 93, and his job in the trials was to go underwater after each drop on a one-man chariot, which is a one-man submarine, and inspect the casing on the weapons. They couldn't raise them, and he would come up and report to Barnes-Wallis exactly what had happened, and Barnes-Wallis would ring the factory, which was down here near Liverpool, and make adjustments to the structure of the weapon. Highball suffered some technical difficulties, so this was one, and in a minute we'll show you the second, which was essentially the release mechanism from the aircraft itself. So what was Highball all about, and what was it designed for? So we know that upkeep was used against the dam walls, and we know why. Highball was designed as an anti-ship weapon, and the specific target for Highball was the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was in the same class as the Bismarck, and for those of you who know your history, Bismarck was sunk by Royal Naval engagement out in the Atlantic, and both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz were designed to attack the sea lines of communication between the US and the UK, and the UK and Russia. And the Saint-Nazaire raid, which was carried out by commandos in 1942 to destroy the deep water dock at Saint-Nazaire, actually denied Tirpitz the ability to operate in the Atlantic, and so she was forced to withdraw to Norway because going to the Atlantic from a major base in Germany or Norway involves running the gauntlet either through the Channel or between Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, which was heavily defended at the time. So once the ship was returned to Norway in order to basically combat the convoy system which went up here, the Royal Navy had to keep large resources in Scapa Flow in case she put to sea and to protect the convoys. And clearly this was always a thorn in the side, and so sinking her was a major priority. And Winston Churchill used to call her the beast. He was concerned about what would happen if a surface ship of this side actually got into the major convoy routes at the time. So that was the target, and it was a case of how can you sink her? And if she doesn't put to sea, it's very hard to engage with significant naval forces, which is why she was stored and protected in the fields. It's hard to understand 77 years on why she couldn't be bombed. But in 1943, about 50% of all bombing was outside 5 miles of the target. So we'll talk about how Tirpitz was sunk, but it needed a pretty major technical innovation to be able to target weapons at that time into a reasonable chance of hitting what you're aiming at. But if you can't hit a target within 5 miles, you can't really target a ship from the air. And approaching by sea was tricky because, of course, she was very heavily defended. So it was a problem at the time. Now, the history of the development was there were 2 possible dates for the attack on the Ruhr dams, and that was to do with the state of the moon, the amount of water in the dams, and it was picked for the May the 16th and 17th. Remember that Highball had to be used within 24 hours of the dams raid, and it wasn't because of technical difficulties, one of which was the protecting the round and the other was releasing it from the aircraft, which we'll talk about in a second. But they did, because the mission didn't fly within 24 hours, Tirpitz was attacked in September 1943 using X-craft, and that's what these are. And these are small midget submarines, and they conducted a raid in September 1943. And these midget submarines were developed in Loch Striven specifically for an attack on capital ships. And these would be towed across behind a mother submarine. And if ever you've dived the HMS Stubborn in Malta, she was one of the submarines that towed the X-craft across to attack the Tirpitz. And they used 6 of these, 2 laid charges, 2 were lost on the tow, 1 is still to be found, I hasten to add. 1 was scuttled and 1 was sunk in action. And you can see this is X8, but X6 and 7 actually laid charges underneath the Tirpitz, and it crippled the Tirpitz sufficiently to keep it in the field until the bombing sank it in 1944. Now, what's interesting here, if you look at the top picture on the right, you'll see the submarine and you'll see like a bulbous shape. And at the bottom, you'll see the shape come off. Now, those are what we call the side charges, and that's the weapon on the midget submarine. And the idea is that these submarines would carry a diver. The diver would basically get out of the submarine underwater, cut their way through the submarine nets. The submarine would get underneath the Tirpitz, and it would basically drop those side charges by literally a hand crank system. and then get away, and obviously it would detonate later. Not surprising that there were VCs awarded on this particular raid. But I mention it because, as Kevin will cover on Friday, there are side charges still to be seen in Loch Striven, and they were placed or underneath where the practice targets for testing Highball were moored. So it makes it relatively interesting. So we talked about the problems. That Highball is on the left, and you basically know the structure of it. You can see, if you look closely in the left-hand picture, round about here, you can see a little bit of what the spinning mechanism, and in the bomb bay of the Mosquito, where this is, they were going to be carried in pairs, and this ducting here was the airflow basically to create the backspin prior to weapon release. And the problem that they had, and they couldn't quite surmount, was the fact that the rear store, although it was released after the first store, ended up overtaking the front store and would often collide. And if it collided, then clearly it wouldn't bounce properly and the weapon wouldn't work. And so because of this release issue and the composition of the material within the protective casing, the weapon wasn't ready to go at the time it was needed to go in May 1943, and they struggled with to getting it to operational status, but they did around about September 1943. We talked earlier about big bombs. If you remember Barnes Wallis, this is the Tall Boy, and the Tall Boy was actually used to sink the Tirpitz in the end. So this is the 6-ton bomb, which, if you remember, enters the ground at supersonic speeds, and there were direct hits on the Tirpitz using the Tall Boy deployed from the Lancaster aircraft. So the Highball itself was going to be dropped from this aircraft. So again, for those of you who know your history, this is the Mosquito, and the Mosquito was an all-wooden bowl supply construction aircraft. It had two aircrew, and critically it had a range of about 1,100 miles, and that's really important, what we're about to come on to. But at the time it was fast. It had a speed of about 380 miles per hour, and being all wood, it had a very low radar signature, and obviously getting into the target area employed crossing the Norwegian coast, which was inundated with radar stations at the time. They converted 27 Mosquitoes from their normal roles into the Highball role, and they formed a new squadron called 618 Squadron, which was formed from Coastal Command and Bomber Command squadrons. And Coastal Command pilots and navigators were needed because they understood the difficulty about navigating over water for long periods of time, and Bomber Command understood about dropping things involving bombs. So they had 6 weeks basically to convert to the Mosquito, understand long-range navigation over the sea using little more than stopwatch and compass, and understand how to develop and use this new weapon. So quite a big undertaking for the Mosquito. So looking at the situation, when the raid was conceived, the Tirpitz was actually in Trondheim, which is around about halfway up the Norwegian coast. But the Germans moved her up to Altenfield, which is right at the top, primarily because it was a short way to the convoys that were trying to get around this peninsula into Murmansk. And obviously the Germans were heavily fortified this area, lots of U-boats, but it was a very short sally forth in order to attack the shipping. So that's where they moved to. Now, unfortunately, this location here is 920 miles from the furthest that they could position the Mosquito aircraft, which was here at Sunborough on Shetland. So clearly, if the range of the aircraft is 1,150 miles and it's 920 miles one way, that tells you something about the nature of the mission. And if you read any of the history of 618 Squadron, these pilots and navigators were around 19, 20, 22 years old, and they realized that this was not a return mission. And at 19 or 20, realizing that you're basically being sent on Operation Certain Death was not great for morale. But the idea of the mission was to fly way out into the Norwegian Sea to avoid detection, basically at wave top height, and then turn inwards to attack the Tirpitz in her mooring, and then do something. And this is the interesting bit. So there were basically three options considered. The first option was to continue and land in Russia, or indeed to position the aircraft in Russia and operate from Russia. But they were worried about releasing the technology to the Russians, and they had no way of knowing whether the Russians would simply impound the aircraft and the mission wouldn't actually fly. The second option was to position a Royal Navy ship up in the Arctic Circle, and the air crew, what was left of them, would basically run out of fuel, bail out into the sea, and hopefully be picked up by that ship. Anybody knows anything about Arctic waters, you'll realize that you had about 2 minutes in the water before you were probably dead anyway. So that wasn't a really good solution. And the third option was to fly south, and they were really aiming for the Narvik area. And the reason they wanted to go to Narvik was there was a railway line at Narvik which was used to export iron ore into Sweden. And the idea was that you'd be able to find this railway line at Narvik. You would run out of fuel and crash the mosquitoes into the wooded forest, and then you would basically wait and jump on one of these iron ore trains to get into Sweden, and that would be neutral territory in the war, and so you would escape capture and eventually get back to the UK. So none of those were particularly attractive options if you were 19 or 20, which is why they thought it was pretty much Operation Certain Death. If you look at the actual mission profile itself, so this is interesting, just to give you some feeling of what's involved. So here's the Tirpitz in the mooring. You've obviously got the Outmark, which was basically an air defence platform, and you've got picket ships, and all of this is shore-based defences. And the raids required 20 aircraft, and they were going to basically fly at sea level, do 120-degree turn over the water in order to line up with the Tirpitz around about 1,000 yards out at little more than 60 feet above and release their weapons. And when you realise that the Tirpitz had 110 anti-aircraft weapons on, plus the ones on the shore, plus the ones on the picket ships and the Outmark, you can see, well, there was a fair degree of trepidation about surviving the actual operation itself. Okay, so as we said, they had 6 basic weeks to get this mission up and running, and the initial crews were sent up to RAF Skitten, which is up here near Wick, and that's where the squadron was basically set up. They armed in RAF Turnberry, which is at Edinburgh Airport, and they were doing the tests in Loch Striven, which is here. And they used to practice getting airborne, flying out over the sea, and then coming up here to simulate entering the fields from over the Norwegian Sea to drop their actual weapons. So it sort of mimicked what they were anticipating doing. So where were they actually going? Well, they were going into Loch Striven. Loch Striven lies off the Clyde. And the reason Loch Striven was used is in the war, it was called the Secret Loch. And it was a secret loch because A, it was used for commando training, and B, it was the home of the midget submarine development. And there's a reason for that, which we'll come to shortly. There are no roads, and the only visible way of seeing what's going in is from Butte, and they used to put smoke canisters at the entrance to the loch when everything was going on, so anybody on Butte couldn't see what was going on, and by evacuating the people around the loch, they could be really assured of secrecy. So what you'll see is that the tests were carried up here around about Glen Striven, and it's pretty remote. So I think there's a video coming up which you should see. Gives you an idea of what's there. There's no audio on this, but it just gives you an idea. And the guy I spoke to, remember the diver, he said he remembers basically they had troops lining the hilltops. They'd evacuated all the people. They had smoke going at the entrance to the loch, and then you've got these aircraft coming in and dropping bombs on. It was quite a sight when you were working in the actual vicinity of the weapons testing. And the footage you're going to see shortly is taken from the shoreline on the right as you look at it, as well as from the ships itself. This video from Kevin's drone basically just shows our operating base on the actual side of the loch. And I think, I may be wrong, Kevin, this is the day Kevin almost lost his drone in the strong winds, and we had to go and rescue it. I think he managed to land it on the beach over.
I did indeed land it on that little beach you can see on the other side. Having the wind was so strong, it was faster than the drone could fly, and it disappeared.
Yeah, but that gives you an idea of what the area actually looks like. So let's have a quick look at the test footage. So this is 1943, and you can see the aircraft there. There's some statistics. Dropped about 1,000 yards out. If you remember what he said, one of the problems was the bombs overtaking the lead bomb, which you've just seen. And obviously a number of tests they collided and reduced the effectiveness. And that was a major reason they couldn't get operational approval for the weapon for the May dates. The ships you see, there are basically two ships that were used. So the first ship was the Corvette, which was an early French battleship, and they moored that in the centre of the loch for the initial tests. And the centre of the loch is around about 50 to 60 metres. And at the time it was too difficult. They didn't have the technology to dive to look at the casings. So they moved the target ship into a 30-metre area, and they changed ship. Corvette was actually earmarked for D-Day, and they replaced it with the HMS Malaya, which was an out-of-date ship, which you see in the previous footage, getting the highball treatment along the side. So clearly the issue for finding these things was actually done was initially looked at around 2010. And Kevin tomorrow will show you some very interesting public records information which shows the location of the targets and where they were moored compared to features on the ground. And that gave you a target area. And it's reasonable to expect that the debris field, or in this case, where the highballs are, would be downrange of that point, which is what we spent our time looking for and mapping. And we know they released 196 of these weapons in tests. And one of the things we wanted to do was find out exactly, still down there. So this is the footage that's in the film of 1955. And this is showing you what it's trying to do. If you remember back to the dams footage, you're skipping over the torpedo nets. The backspin holds it against the side of the ship, and it goes underneath the keel. And the keel on the turpits was about the only place that you could get a reasonably small weapon to have any effect. The armour down the side was incredibly thick, so would have negated torpedoes or normal bombs that were carried at that time. But you can see the idea of how it was designed to work in that footage. So just going to show this. So on the left-hand side, this is when it was first raised with all the concretion, and this is with a bit of initial cleaning. So to give you an idea of the highball itself, the operational rounds, they ended up weighing 581 kilos, 272 kilograms were the explosives of Torpex. And what's interesting here is you can see a bit of the balancing section. So just bear that in mind. And you can see the spinning, where the spin was initiated on the actual weapon itself, and on the other side where the fuse would have gone. So we talked, if you think about when you balance a car tyre, you obviously have to spin it, and you put those little metal blocks on it, don't you, to make sure it spins evenly. And that's exactly what this is. It's static balancing, and this is how they did it. And if you remember, they were very concerned about the first bomb not overtaking the second one and not colliding underneath the aircraft. And this was all to do with the wobble and making sure it bounced true. So it's quite interesting still to see the static, the balance mechanism still on the recovered highball. Show a picture here of the hydrostatic fuse. So the hydrostatic fuse is basically to allow the weapon to submerge sufficiently. It was designed to go off around 8 meters, and it's simply a pressure and a plunger with a spring system that will ignite the store underneath the aircraft itself. Now, we talked earlier about how they sunk. So this is what we call the stabilized automatic bomb sight, or SABS. It's a picture. And if you remember, at the time, 50% of all bombing was outside 5 miles. And obviously the width of the turpits, albeit the length is quite long, it's quite a small target if you've got that level of accuracy. But this bomb sight, which was handmade, enabled an accuracy of just under 100 meters from 15,000 feet. And it was only developed for 617 Squadron and using the tall boy from the Lancaster. So not many were built, and they were used successfully and ultimately used to sink the Tirpitz. And the Tirpitz was sunk, remember, it was damaged in September 1943 and then sunk by 617 in 1944. So if you can dive the site of the Tirpitz, it's mostly been reclaimed, but there's loads of debris fields on the bottom, and obviously huge loss of German sailor life. So totally to be respected. There's lots of videos online, diving the Tirpitz site if you're particularly interested. So I'm just going to show you this. So just before I get going, just to complete the history of 618. So by September of 1943, they hadn't been used operationally. And the reason was they got over the technical issues of the release. They didn't really get away about the one-way mission. And the Tirpitz never moved further south than where she was. So the mission never went. The Air Force couldn't leave a squadron not doing anything ad infinitum. So they decided to mount a different sort of attack and went with the X-craft, which left 618 basically free, and they turned it into an anti-submarine role, and then ultimately they sent it out to the Far East for the war in Japan. And this is Eric Winkle, and Eric Winkle was a very famous, he's passed away unfortunately, naval test pilot, and he did the deck landing trials of the Mosquito. So it's quite interesting just to hear his story as part of how 618 would have gone on with Highball post the Tirpitz issue. If I can get that to work. No.
It was all a preparation for Operation Highball. This was going to be sending 2 carriers to Japan, loaded with mosquitoes, carrying the spinning bomb, not the dam busters type bomb, which looked like an oil can, an oil drum, but a totally spherical bomb, which would fit into the mosquito bomb bay. Still protruding, but it would go in there. The idea was to make a dam busters type attack on capital ships in Japanese harbors, and then return to the carrier and attempt to land on, or bail out or whatever. They hoped to recover the losses because there were 24 going to take part in this operation. 2 aircraft carriers carrying between them 24 Mosses.
Rockets were also fitted to decrease the takeoff run. The rocket motors are jettisoned when all burnt. This picture shows the Mosquito doing crash barrier tests in HMS Triumph. The film is slowed down.
That gives you an idea. And what happened to 618, you'll often ask. Well, 618, the aircraft did go to Australia, but the Japanese war moved fairly quickly, and the operational Highball weapons got dumped in the sea off Sydney, and the aircraft got packaged and brought back to the UK. So Highball was delayed, but became operational, but was never used in anger. So I'm going to spend probably about 5 or 10 minutes now just talking about how the project came about. So it started just after the first class diver. So having done my first class diver, I was determined to put it to use, and I wanted a project. And I knew about this man, Dr. Ian Murray. And Dr. Ian Murray is the author of several books on dam busters, and he's involved with the Barnes-Wallis Foundation. And in 2010, he had thought to himself, was there an active highball around? And if the Brooklands Museum, they've got all of the weapons developed by Barnes-Wallis except a highball. And he knew the tests were done in Loch Striven. And he'd done an initial exploration using essentially a commercial diver to see if any could be found. And he did it by basically matching the Imperial War Museum footage with the real loch. And they did find a couple of examples on the seabed. So he knew they were there, but it basically didn't progress then till I turned up in 2016. So I got on the train and went up to Dundee University to see him. And he was a bit suspicious at first, but he basically outlined all he knew and gave quite a bit of documented history about the tests and trials, but he had no mechanism in order to recover and raise them. And what made it a great test site in 30 metres of water meant that it was probably a good site for a recreational dive project. So I, having spoken with him and basically saying, yes, I can do it, I went away, got in touch with Kev, and we put our heads together about what needed to be done. And the first thing to say is that these things are owned by somebody, and they're owned by the Royal Air Force. And he had not been able to progress against the MOD to get any form of formal position to recover one. But one of the guys on my first class diver exam was called Simon Smith, who is a colonel in the army. And he actually worked down the hall from RAF Heritage and MOD. And he knew the officer concerned. And he said, I'll go and speak to him, which he duly did. And through that level of personal contact, we managed to get permission from RAF Heritage. And if anyone says, well, what's the point of doing first class diver? Well, you develop some great contacts and some great people to help you move these things forward. Now, I then approached the RAF Hendon, which is the museum, and they weren't interested at all. So that was a bit disappointing, but we had to think about what was involved. And the first thing we needed to know was obviously we had to lift it. And lifting it involves a license. And that then started about a 12-month escapade with Marine Scotland. If anyone wants to know about lifting licenses, it's a long and painful process, but essentially you fill out a form, and the form they sent me was to do with establishing a wind farm in the North Sea, but it was the only form they had. And then they send out your application basically to everybody from Scottish Heritage down to the RYA. Everybody then puts in their complaints or questions, and you then have to field and answer those questions. And you then have to pay various fees. So, for instance, you have to pay something to the Clyde Port Authority for generating a notice to mariners. You have to pay something to the Crown Estate for mucking around on their seabed. You've got to put a public notice in a library or post office on the nearest habitable settlement, which was Bute. You have to put something in the newspapers to allow any public response to it. And we did all of that. And eventually we produced we got the license, which I'll show you on the next page. Simultaneously, we applied to the BSAC expedition grant, and we got awarded £1,000 from that. Now, one of the things that became apparent was, although public records showed that the rounds were inert, in order to donate them to a museum, we needed a free from explosives certificate. And you know, the commercial cost for doing that ran into about £6,000, which was prohibitive. Our budget was £7,700, of which £1,000 came from the expedition grant, and the rest was self-funding. So the suggestion came up about using the Royal Navy, and around the corner from Loch Striven is Holy Loch, and they have the Northern Diver group there, which is obviously a military diving unit. And I rang up the officer commanding and suggested that he might like to get involved, as it was an ideal training situation, recovering mines from the seabed, and he leapt at the chance. And so we got involved, and he offered to provide the heavy lift equipment, which, as you'll see, was a key part of successful completion, plus the free from explosives certificate as part of it. Now, we then set 3 objectives, Kevin and myself. So one was to recover 2 highballs. Second objective was to map all the highballs in the lot that were still there. And the third objective was to see what else we could find in Loch Striven, which meant we needed specialist equipment, noticeably side scan and preferably towed side scan. So I inquired at HQ, and we don't hold that kit. So I looked at hiring one, and I could hire a side scan unit, a towed one, but I couldn't insure it. And I even went to Lloyd's of London to try and get insurance on this thing, because they cost about £60,000 to £80,000, and it was just impossible. So I had to rethink, and in the end I got a flight up to Aberdeen, and I went round all of the oil and gas exploration companies and pitched them the story of the project, and saw if they were willing to lend a side scan operator and a side scan unit for publicity. And I think Kevin will remember the day I called him up and said, yes, we've got one. And essentially, they import a lot of this technology from the States, and they've got to test it. And they always are looking for projects to test the units on. And so this CEO basically said, yes, we'll use your project as a test. So we had the side scan unit. So I said, great, we can pull that behind a rib. And he said, no chance. And then he said, why don't you stick it on the Navy boat? So I asked the Navy, and they said, no chance, you're not touching our deck. And so we had a problem. And in the end, we then had to go to some exploration companies to see if anybody would basically donate their ship. And we found one, ironically, called Aspect, and Kevin will take you through them tomorrow. But they agreed to give us 2 days of their use of their ship in exchange for publicity to plough the whole of Loch Striven to produce the amazing images that Kevin will show you tomorrow. It's really, really, really interesting. We had one other guy that bolted on.
Mark, sorry, the second part 2 is on Friday night, not tomorrow.
Oh, Friday, yeah. Sorry,
yeah, sorry,
Friday.
Just have everybody trying to dial in tomorrow.
We had one other guy bolt onto the expedition who was basically developing an ROV, and you'll see his footage, and he rang us up and asked to be involved. So we agreed to him participating. So that was the mechanics of getting the people together. As far as BSAC concerned, Kevin was DO of East Cheshire Sub-Aqua Club, was providing the boats and dive kit from the club. So we elected to give half the places to the club in a developmental role, and the other half basically went to key members, which Kevin will cover off tomorrow, that had the experience to run this expedition with Kevin and myself. So this is a copy of the permission document. That's what you work so hard. There are 2 things about lifting stuff. For those of you who go away, great fun doing an expedition, but A, you need permission, and B, you need a restoration system in place. And we had agreed to take ours to the Mary Rose Trust. So make sure you got both those in place if you're going to do a project. Okay, so on the left is the free from explosives certificate from the Navy, and on the right is the top secret document that goes to show how we knew the rounds were basically inert. So I'm just going to come out of this for a moment. Hopefully you're going to see this shortly.
Striven in the Second World War was one of the most secret places in the United Kingdom. Since Loch Striven was already quite a lonely place, and it had been sealed off as a sort of top secret test location for the midget submarines, they also used it for the testing of Highball, which was the anti-ship bouncing bomb. Alternative plan that was part of Barnes-Wallis's scheme to destroy the dams was to use a similar bouncing bomb, actually a smaller one, and use it in a sort of an anti-ship roll, so that the bomb would skip along the water over any torpedo nets that were around the target ship and sink and explode underneath the ship where there wasn't any armour. Highball, that was the anti-ship bomb, was a smaller cylinder, again padded out, and then eventually with a metal plate right the way around it. And because it was smaller, the impact forces weren't quite so large, and the padding was able to stay on, and it worked as a ball rather than as a cylinder.
Barnes-Wallis himself was a great designer, great engineer. His idea of making the bouncing bomb is an amazing feat of engineering. It's been a great honour for myself, a great honour for the fellas that have been working on the project, because we respect the fact that the people who have went before us and actually delivered these bombs as a project that they had, and today we're part of their project. And with the anniversary that's coming up, it's a proud moment for all of us on board this boat today to be bringing that history back to the surface.
We're going to be the only people ever in the history of mankind who see them underwater and be part of this history that we've made today. We're here at the end of the project at Loch Striven and just reflecting on why we're here. Barnes-Wallis was a complete innovator. He was a scientist, and he wanted to use his knowledge and science to shorten the war through making innovative weapons. And one of those was the Highball, the bouncing bomb, which was only used here at Loch Striven. It's been a huge honour really to make that happen and achieve it. If I can just come back in, I think one thing that's absolutely amazing in all of this, when I look back on it, is how a British sub-aqua club a group of recreational divers can set out to achieve something, which took them to Kensington Palace for the Duke of Cambridge, as it was then, the Scuba Award, fairly high level TV coverage, including getting Getty images and stuff. And actually, considering we initiated and coordinated the project, and as you'll find out tomorrow, was largely responsible for its success, or not tomorrow, on Friday. It is an amazing achievement. I don't think the members of our club, under Kev's divine leadership, would have expected to take that journey as a member of British Sub Aqua Club, and it just goes to show what is possible. And publicly, I would like to thank Kevin for his support throughout the whole of that, without which it wouldn't have been possible. Okay, so we're going to take questions, and remember, Friday is Kevin's recount of what actually happened on the expedition. Anybody got any questions?
Dave Gaze is asking, why did you only recover 2?
So you have to apply for a license, and we wanted one for the de Havilland Museum, which built the Mosquito, and it's there, you can see it at St Albans, and we wanted one for the Brooklands Museum, which is obviously in Brooklands, near Farnborough, and that's what we applied the license for. And subsequently, museums around the world actually asked, but I think in conjunction with RAF Heritage, we took the view that it's better to leave them in situ. And remember, there were none to see. There are now 2 to see, historic homes having been restored. And as Kevin will outline, we produced a diver trail so other people could basically enjoy what is an underwater museum.
Yes, in fact, tomorrow we'll get to see a bit of that underwater trail, that dive trail, Friday even, I'm doing it now. On Friday we'll get to see some of the video of that, and indeed there is a video of that dive trail with all the details of the GPS coordinates you need to drop right on top of it and not only see the anchor chain and the great big anchor that's in the middle of all of these, but the high balls and the side charge. So you get a full set for the price of one dive. Nick Barter asks, who restored them?
Okay, so funnily enough, when we got one of the benefits of dealing with a group of people who know what they're talking about is when you haven't got an obvious solution to a problem, somebody will come up to something. I can't remember how, but we came up with the idea of using the bulk carriers. I think they're called IBMs. They basically contain a ton of water, but they're the perfect size for carrying the highballs. Now, we knew that as soon as we got them out of the water, they were going to start to corrode, and we needed to transport them in fresh water. And the advice we got from the Mary Rose Trust was you needed basically a sugar solution. So we kept them for probably, I can't remember whether it was 6 weeks or 8 weeks, but we kept them at the club, starting the desalination process on one of the rounds, which was going to Brooklands, and we wanted that because we did a series of promotional events, and we just started the desalination process. It then went off to the Mary Rose Trust, and it basically took the best part of 2 years to complete that process. The other highball went straight to de Havilland Museum, and they did it themselves. I mean, it's not difficult. You just got to leave it in a solution, which you gradually reduce you dip test it for salinity every couple of weeks, and you just change the water and reduce it until you're not getting a reading, and then you basically paint it with some metal paint. And that's basically all they've done. And there's a good video on YouTube of the round arriving in Brooklands from the Mary Rose Trust restored.
Yes. John asks, are there any plans to run a trip back to dive the Highball Trail? Well, East Cheshire have been back twice. We've done some 3D photogrammetry on them, so we've now got models, 3D models of one of the bombs, which you can view on online. Any club is welcome to go. You don't actually need permission. It's Loch Striven is an open sea loch. You can put in largs and go straight round in the boat, about 12 kilometres. So all the details are on the East Cheshire website, and I'll provide the details on the Friday session. So anybody can go. I believe all the clubs have also been, but to say my advice would be get involved with the club if you're not already, and talk to the diving officer and go and visit them. It's not difficult. Right. Well, thank you for the positive feedback, and thank you, Mark, for again an excellent presentation. I think actually, to be fair, you've added a fair bit of additional information to this one from the first one. You've obviously continued to research and gather information on the Highballs, and it's one of those things, you know, you'd never forget. It was a fabulous project, fabulous, the whole thing, you know, fabulous expeditions. So I think we want to do some more. And certainly, if you want to see what the diving looked like and a bit of the background in terms of the planning and the activities and all the coordination of the various people involved, come back Friday. We'll see you then. Thanks for joining us. Much appreciated.
Okay, bye everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks. Great job, guys.
Cheers. Much appreciated.